I thank the honourable member. Order. I have received messages from His Excellency the Governor-General notifying assent to several bills. I do not propose to read the titles, which will be recorded in the votes and proceedings. Clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 1. Tax and Superannuation Laws Amendment Employee Share Schemes Bill 2015. Resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question. Thank you, Clerk. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. I give the call to the member for Melbourne. I think he's ready.
Yep. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to make a few brief advisedly for the person who's after me, comments in support of this legislation. The legislation makes what can only be described as a common-sense change, and that is to make it easier for people who are in a position who want to have start-up companies succeed and to be part of that from the ground. Now, what we do know is that some of the changes that had been made before attempted to strike the right balance but didn't in fact do so. And they did that because an upfront tax bill was essentially imposed on the people who wanted to join in on start-up companies from the beginning. And in Australia we have a significant challenge, which is to grow those sectors of our economy that aren't reliant on dig it up, chop it down, ship it off mentality. And to do that, we're going to need to create an environment and an ecosystem that will support companies and businesses that put a premium on innovation. So, to that extent, this bill makes a sensible change, and it will provide, in addition to removing the upfront tax bill, it's also going to provide tax concessions for start-ups acquiring shares under schemes, and employees of start-ups who are issued options will get a 15% income tax deduction when those options are exercised after 3 years. Now, that's a series of sensible moves. There's two things that this bill doesn't do, though, that need further attention. One is address the critical issue of how, in an environment where we support start-ups, we also ensure that people who are genuine employees aren't forced to live on less than the income they would otherwise get if they were treated as bona fide employees. That is, we have to make sure that arrangements that are struck in the course of start-up businesses or that are struck in similar areas don't undermine the basic floor of minimum wages and conditions that people would take for granted. We've seen under this government the proliferation of the carving out of sections of the Australian workforce from Australian minimum standards. We see it with the use of certain kinds of visas. We see it with the use of contracting out and proliferation of independent contract arrangements that could only be said to be designed to avoid minimum standards and, in that context, potentially undermining tax revenue as well. But that is something that needs to be addressed, and sadly this bill doesn't do that. It's no reason to stand in the way of this bill, but that is something that does need further attention. Secondly, and I spoke at the start about the need to create a supportive ecosystem. If we're wanting to create the environment in Australia where we can grow those sectors of the economy that are based on innovation and based on our intellect, then we need to be ensuring that research and development and innovation in this country is supported. And yet we find ourselves spending, under this government, the lowest that this country has spent on research and development and innovation since we started keeping records. The lowest since we started keeping records. We are at an over 30-year low on spending on research and development and innovation in this country. So you can't, on the one hand, create a notional legal framework that supports the establishment of start-ups and supports the establishment of innovation, at the same time as you take the axe to other tax concessions like research and development tax concessions, but also take the axe to those public institutions that help create the environment to partner with the private sector to grow research and development and innovation in this country. We are going to need to have something to sell the rest of the world when the rest of the world tells us to stop digging. And that point may come sooner rather than later. And to do that, we have to be clear that we can't compete with China and India on wages, nor should we try to. Our advantage in Australia, in this region, is going to be based on our mines. And that means putting in place the kind of investments in research and development and innovation that other countries are doing, that our trading partners are doing. Korea or Japan are well above 3, on their way to 4, and possibly even higher % of their GDP being spent on research and development. The US has set itself a goal of 3% of GDP, public and private investment and spending on research and development, and yet here in Australia we languish at 2.2 and going lower under this government, So it's not enough to come with a piece of legislation that makes a common sense change. You also need to match it with supporting the innovation ecosystem. That's something that we've seen under successive governments attacked every budget time. Every time it comes to budget, to the federal budget, governments seem to treat the R&D pool as a bit of a honeypot to dip into. And the consequence of that is that people don't see Australia as a place to continue to invest or to start a job and continue a job. If you are a young scientist, if you are a young researcher who could be about to contribute a groundbreaking discovery, and every May you see the threat of funding cuts to research and development, and then you look overseas to countries like the US or UK where they have a stable funding environment, you understand why many of them choose to join the brain drain and go overseas. We need to stop that, and the only way to stop that will be to set Australia on a path to 3% of GDP, something we, the Greens, have been calling for a while, and I'm glad to see that the opposition is now supportive of that. It's time for the government to get on board as well, because if we get on board in increasing our funding for science, research and development and innovation, then measures like this bill, welcome as they are, will really start to bite and we'll be able to grow that sector of the new economy.